So thank you. So now, did I share the screen yet? No, I did not.
James, real quick, are you going to provide a list of texts to be used for the 102 class? What books are we using for this class?
Well, there's only one book. Yeah, there's only one book, which is the main book. It's going to be Robert Johnson's Inner Work. And although it's not the ideal book that I'd like to use, there isn't another book there that really, he's one example of how to do this kind of work, how to apply. The whole point of this course is how to apply theory. And he's one way to do it. He's very close to the Jungian method, but the real Jungian method is no method. I mean, Jung was very much someone who wanted people to learn a lot of methods and then use the one that worked in a given situation. So that will be an example, and we're going to have a lot. I've already scanned a lot of documents and things and put them in Haiku. There's going to be a lot of extra curricular readings that will be available as PDF files in the Haiku online learning section. So if you want to, even if you don't want to get the certificate, if you want to take advantage of these extra readings, of the videos, and of the videos of the classes next week, that class will be recorded if technology works with us and doesn't fail us. But we'll post that in Haiku. So if you want to see that, you have to learn how to get into Haiku. It's very easy. It's a very, very simple process. But that will be the sort of clearinghouse for all of the additional readings and additional information. But the main book is Inner Work by Robert Johnson. And if you are not familiar with Jung's theory, this is about applied theory. We had a whole 8-module course on Jung's theory, and it was based on a textbook that we used by Murray Stein called Jung's Map of the Soul. So if you need some brushing up, there are many different books you can get to get some background on Jungian theory if you're not already familiar. But the one we used is Jung's Map of the Soul by Murray Stein. And so I recommend that to you if you're thinking of taking this course and you just want to be able to check yourself on the precise Jung's own words and his own approach to this kind of work. That's the book we used. So I'm going to go ahead now. If there's no other questions. Did that answer your question, Jeremy?
Yeah, good to go. Thank you.
Sure. And so I'm going to go ahead and share that. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. This is Jung 102, Applied Jungian Psychology. My name is James Newell. I appreciate you joining us. And as I said, Jeremy is taking care of the tech side, and Bonnie is here. And between all of us, hopefully we can, Bonnie Bright, of course, the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, between all of us, we should be able to answer your questions and help you to get an idea of what's going on here. So again, thank you for joining us. Before we get into the sort of meat of what I want to talk about today, I want to give you a little idea on this project, which Bonnie mentioned a little bit about, but the Depth Psychology Alliance has been working for a long time on the idea of putting together a certification program. And recently, Bonnie and I have been working quite a lot together on a program that would provide a credential for a broad spectrum of individuals who would like to add a depth psychology component to the work that they do or to the work that they would like to do. Today's class and the 8-week program that follows are part of our ongoing efforts to provide quality, affordable depth psychology programs to the general public. Last fall, we presented our first 8-module course, Jung 101, an Introduction to Jungian Psychology, which was well attended and very well received. And with Jung 102, the course that we're going to begin next week, and today is the free introduction to that course. With Jung 102, Applied Jungian Psychology, we'll be introducing Jungian methods and techniques for applying Jungian ideas to practical psychological work. So we were pretty much, there's a lot of theory, and as I said, if you haven't read a lot of theory, you may want to get one of the many books on theory. One I recommend is Murray Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul. That's what we use as our textbook for Jung 101. But what we're doing now is based on the assumption that there's some understanding of theory, and the question then is, well, how do we make use of this? How do we apply that? Well, that's what we're going to try and do in the next 8 weeks following this introductory class, that is. So with this program of courses that we're putting together, our intention has been to deliver an alternative to expensive graduate programs, yet still deliver solid, dependable content that is affordably priced. Our future plans, based upon public interest and the feedback we get on these first two courses, are to follow up these courses in the fall of 2017 with a full rollout of our certification program. The program will begin with a course entitled An Introduction to Depth Psychology, and as the name suggests, this will be an in-depth introductory course on the history, theories, and practices that form the foundations of depth psychology. Students who have earned credit in Jung 101, the course we did last fall, and Jung 102, the course that's coming up, may apply those credits toward this proposed certification program. So before we roll into the sort of lift off into this Jung 102, the introduction to that and the basics, I'm going to run through all of the modules and what we're going to cover. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I know for many people who are on today who are in Jung 101, this is, you know me a little bit already, and you already know some of the things I've been saying, but this is for those of you who may not be familiar with myself or the work we're doing. So although I did not begin my formal education until I was 40 years old, I've been reading and studying Jung since I was 18, and here's a little overview of my own journey. At the age of 4, I experienced a traumatic injury and hospitalization. I grew up and recovered. My history of trauma led me to seek out healing experiences throughout my life. And for me, I've experienced the most healing through musical performance. I'm a professional musician. Through spiritual practice and through Jungian psychology, which was profoundly helpful to me. I dropped out of high school when I was 15 years old to work in a blues band. And while traveling on the road, I began to study world religions, mythology, and Jung. After marrying in my mid-20s, my interest in Jung led me eventually to Vanderbilt University, where I earned a master's degree in counseling and theology with a focus on Jungian theory, and then a doctorate in the history of religions, focusing on the use of music in religious practice. And that's just to let you know kind of where I'm coming from, which is not probably the traditional academic nor Jungian approach. But I think that's true with a lot of people who are drawn to depth psychology. In any case, my own interest in working with the Depth Psychology Alliance in general, and in teaching these courses in particular, is twofold. First, I want to help and empower others effectively to do their own inner work. And secondly, I want to help and empower practitioners in various modalities to better serve and empower those with whom they do their own inner work. So that's a little background on me and my motivations, but what are we going to do in this course? In this first introductory class, this first session, we're going to run through a brief overview of basic Jungian theory. And as I said, those of you who are in Jung 101, this will be a refresher for you. But I also want to clarify exactly where we're going in Jung 102. The application is only meaningful if we kind of know what it is that we're applying. So we'll then look at some of the ways in which Jungian psychology can be of enormous practical value for individual personal growth, as well as collective cultural transformation. And finally, we'll run through a brief overview of how we will approach these practical concerns in this course by applying Jungian theory step by step through a variety of methods and techniques. Like Jung 101, this is a survey course. It's designed to empower you by introducing you to a number of ways to apply Jungian theory. In other words, a survey means that we're going through a lot of different material. Each module could easily be an 8-week course. And as a matter of fact, this module where we're going to talk about theory was an 8-week course that we taught last fall, Jung 101. So I'm going to try and squeeze a lot of Jung 101 into the first part of this introductory class. But as we go through the modules in Jung 102, there'll be a module on Dreamwork, which could easily be 8 weeks. There'll be a module on amplification, or rather on the active imagination, which could easily be an 8-week course, one on mythology, one on dreamwork, one on fairytales, and one on alchemy, which could probably be a 16-week course. But these are all, each one of these provides a variety of ways to apply Jungian theory. And the idea of a survey course is to allow you to see where your interests are directed, give you a lot of resources, and believe me, I'll give you lots and lots of resources that you will be able to follow up on when you decide which way resonates best for you. But it also shows that these different interests of Jung, people sometimes see all the different things that Jung was interested in, and they think, well, this guy, he just couldn't focus his mind. He was so scattered. But each one of these has a particular reason and a particular purpose, and is very useful when used in a particular way to enact the theory that sort of forms the framework for everything that Jung did. And so what we're going to try and do is provide you with a way to really dig into that and see what's going to work for you. Now, another thing before I even get started, I want to say, and this happens in every, I think, educational program in depth psychology. Certainly it happened in Jung 101, and it certainly happens whenever anybody studies Jung. And that is that there's two things going on. We're accumulating information, we're learning things, but at the same time, there's little awakenings happen inside. We're applying these things as we go to our own inner state, to our own inner work. So it's real easy to get lost, because I'll be talking, or maybe you'll be reading something, and all of a sudden it clicks on some work that you're doing, and your mind goes off, and you kind of lose track of where you were in the progression of the ideas that you're studying. So expect that to happen. That's just something that happens when we do study depth psychology material, and it's a reason to go back, review, look at once you've gone through a class, go back and watch the video again, take notes, so you kind of know where you are in your inner work, but you also know where you are in the process of accumulating information that may be helpful to you as you continue on. So now I'm going to start with an overview of Jung's theory and how we're going to apply that when we get into applications of the theory. So the first place to start is basic Jungian terminology. Many of you will be familiar with these terms, I hope. Certainly those of you who are in Jung 101 are familiar with many of these terms. Ego, unconscious, personal unconscious, and collective unconscious. For Jung, of course, there's two layers, and you can see this in the little diagram on the right here, the personal unconscious, and below that, the collective unconscious. The ego up here on the center of the top part. Complexes are not represented in this little diagram, but complexes are an essential part of Jung's theory. Psychic energy. This is as we look at this is a sort of a anatomy, a slice of what are really metaphorical concepts. If you cut open a brain, you're not going to find an ego or a self like that. Likewise, it's not a static entity like this that we see here. Psychic energy is the flow, the dynamic flow of energy as it goes through the psyche. It's the life energy that enlivens all of us. It's a vital, the theory of psychic energy in Jung is particular. We had a whole module on psychic energy and how we regulate it, how we make sure we're not overwhelmed by it. All of these are important aspects of the application of the theory. Archetypes, probably that as constituents of the collective unconscious, archetypes are what distinguishes Jung from probably all other psychological theories. Archetypes are, clearly I'm not going to get into that now. Again, we had lots and lots to say about that in Jung 101, and that's something, if you don't know about archetypes, you want to read a lot about in preparation for a course like this. Persona, this is what we build as a, you could say as a constituent of the ego in order to interact with the social group. Then the shadow are the things that we don't want the social group to see, and we leave out of the persona, and we bury down here in the personal unconscious. The anima and animus, which are the contrasexual side of, originally, Jung just talked about the shadow, and or actually originally talked about the anima and animus and didn't separate it out from the shadow. But the shadow, he said, tends to be the same sex, and when it appears in dreams and in active imagination exercises. The anima animus tends to be the opposite sex. And there's lots of nuances to that, which again, I won't get into, but these are some of the basic terms that will come up when we're talking about applying Jung's theory in practical ways. And the primary archetype, the thing that really not only sets Jung apart from other psychological theories, but also sets Jung apart from many people who will call themselves Jungians, but they sort of jettison or don't pay much attention to the archetype of the self. But for Jung and for classical Jungians, the archetype of the self is the key to the whole ball of wax, very, very important element of Jung's theory. So these are the basic terms, which you'll hear over and over again. And I'm happy to, if you have questions about any of them, I'm happy to address that. But there are things you'll want to be at least familiar with as we go through the application of theory. And the whole thing put together, the sort of manifestation of the self and the working relationship between the self and the ego, and the uncovering of the unconscious and integration of unconscious factors into ego consciousness. So there's a working, ongoing relationship, what we call an ego-self axis between these two elements. That's what we call the process of individuation, becoming an individual who is completely aware of all of the things that are available to the psyche. All of the constituents of the self are available when we are working through effectively the process of individuation. So that's those basic terms. Now, to underline the importance of understanding the basics of Jungian theory, I'd like to begin by showing how these basic concepts can be helpful in using a Jungian approach to the psyche and to inner work. To begin with, what is at stake is cultural generativity. Each of us, each mature human being, must learn how to transform narcissism into healthy self-esteem, and with a sense of healthy self-esteem, provide generative care for our families, for our communities, for our culture, and for the planet. And that's really, in many ways, the goal of Jungian psychology, is to get culture moving on the right track by enough individuals doing the inner work that's required for that to happen. Now, I've not been looking at the chat room because I'm doing this, but I see a lot of activity there. Are there, Jeremy, let me know if there are questions that I should address.
So far, so good.
So, okay. And if I'm going, I'm kind of going quickly. I know if I'm going too fast, let me know. I can slow down. I want to make sure I get through everything, but I don't want to go so fast that I'm plowing over people and they can't hear what I'm saying.
Want to do that?
Thank you. All right. So from the Jungian perspective, such a transformation from narcissism to generativity cannot be accomplished without learning how to regulate instinctual energies, that is, to regulate archetypal energies as mature men and women. And that process of regulating these instinctual energies is the process of individuation. So what follows will be a brief overview of what is involved in regulating instinctual archetypal energies by engaging in a slow, and believe me, not only in learning, but in, if you're working with other people, and especially if you're doing this work yourself, the key word is always patience. Jungian psychology is not something that you do a weekend workshop and then you're done. What you learn is how to engage in a daily practice that will be with you hopefully the rest of your life, because the regulation of these energies, these life energies that flow through us, this fountain of being that flows through us, does not stop just because we stop doing inner work. It keeps going, but it operates unconsciously. So the more conscious we can be, and the more we can develop a routine of working with these energies, the better off we'll be. And it's something that takes a long time. Okay, so individuation. This is the regulation of these energies. Jung's word for this is individuation. Individuation is the word that Jung used to describe the differentiation of the conscious ego from the unconscious self. As Jung says, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images, that is, archetypes, on the other. Now, it's important to recognize that there are two types of individuation. We could say essentially that one is a natural process and the other is an artificial process. Individuation is essentially a natural developmental process that all living beings go through. Some organisms have adaptive processes and some simply develop along organic lines. For example, an acorn has within it a sort of blueprint, we would say archetypes as Jungians, of an oak tree. And it expects to, when it encounters the environment, it expects certain things. And if those things are all there, an equivalent of what a mythologist calls an innate response mechanism gets triggered, and it starts to become an oak tree. Now, if there's a rock in the way, the oak tree has to either learn to go around the rock or it just never develops any further. Likewise, with us, if there's something in the way, we have to develop some adaptive process to get around it. Now, human beings have developed the adaptive processes of religious practices that have historically helped the natural individuation process along because of the particular way in which consciousness has developed in human beings. We've had to develop some way to regulate these energies that flow through us and keep us connected with the organism, because consciousness is a sort of it's almost like an appendix. It's an extra epiphenomena of the psyche, which is not there in all creatures, this self-reflective consciousness that we have. So human beings, to regulate that, and we've talked about this quite a lot in Jung 101, I won't go into it a lot now, but this is part of the natural process of individuation for humans, is to use spiritual practice, religious rites and rituals, and things like that to help regulate the energies of the psyche. Now, what we're calling the artificial process is the process that we actively, consciously engage in through doing individual inner work or working with a therapist in individual or group settings. In other words, the work that I'm talking about for Jung 102 as applied Jungian psychology is what we could call an artificial process of individuation, because we're not just allowing it to happen, we're consciously saying should be happening, and I'm going to help it along. I'm going to work with it in a way that will make it happen, hopefully, more smoothly. So we call this process artificial because of the proactive involvement of consciousness with the natural unconscious developmental processes. It is easy to try to rush this artificial process along, but much patience, as I've already said, is required. The art of individuation requires the patience to wait for the unconscious to act when the unconscious is ready, and not to try to force it. There's a lovely story that Murray Stein tells in his book Transformation about someone who saw a butterfly in a cocoon, and he could see the butterfly was just about to break out of the cocoon, and it was so beautiful. He wanted to see the butterfly, and so he wanted to help the butterfly break out of the cocoon. So he kind of tore away some of the stuff to help it along, and in fact, he killed the butterfly because the natural process was not allowed to complete itself. And we do the same thing when we are not patient enough to wait for the natural unfoldment, like a butterfly or a caterpillar changing into a butterfly. Our archetypal emergence through the individuation process has to happen from within naturally. We can't intervene, even though we want to create consciously an environment in which it can happen. We have to be careful not to interfere with the unconscious itself. We have to let the unconscious grow like a small child You can't force a child to grow any faster than it's going to grow. And the unconscious is much the same. Now, just as there are two types of individuation, there are also two stages of individuation. The first stage is the task of the first half of life and involves the natural development of personality, social adaptation, such as developing a persona, finding a mate, developing a work path, and finding one's own place in society. The second stage involves integrating the shadow and learning to regulate the energies of the collective unconscious, and especially the archetype of the self. Jung focused a great deal of his energy on studying this second stage of individuation. It's very important to know exactly which stage of the individuation process that someone is working on. The tasks required for the first stage require building a strong ego and a functional relationship with the outer world. These tasks require a very different type of focus from the tasks of the second stage. The second stage has more to do with developing a relationship with the objects of the inner world. First stage tends to be with the outer world. Second stage tends to be with the inner world. Now, this can vary. We're talking about a sort of arbitrary norm. Sometimes someone who's introverted starts right in on the second stages of life and works on the inner world really intensely, and only later in life works on the first stage. That was certainly true with me in many ways. And there's also times when we're working on both stages at the same time. There may be, through trauma or something, part of me is well developed and adapted to the outer world, but another part of me is absolutely not adapted to the outer world, and I have to kind of work on both at the same time.
There's a question here, James.
Yes.
Can we impede the individuation process?
Sure. Yeah. We do it all the time. It's a modern culture, it would seem, is uniquely designed to impede the individuation process. We want everyone to be the same and to follow a certain path and to do, it's the old story of the parents want me to go to accounting school and I want to go to be in the Peace Corps or something. There's all kinds of ways other people and we ourselves can impede it. Now, the thing is, if the question is, can we stop it? The answer is no. What happens, there's one Jungian, one of my favorites, named Anthony Stevens, who talks in terms of evolutionary psychology, and he sees Jung as an evolutionary psychologist. And he says that if what I'm describing here, or what the question being, can you interfere with it? If someone interferes, as we often, most people, I'd say, in our culture, in one way or another, are interfering with their own individuation process. And what he calls that is frustration of archetypal intent. As I said with the oak tree expects certain things in the environment and expects when water comes, when it senses that there's sunlight and earth there, it triggers this innate response mechanism and it begins to grow. If there's a rock there and it can no longer grow, that's a frustration of that, you could say, archetypal intent of the oak tree. Likewise, if I have something, a mother comes and starts nurturing me, and the archetype of the mother is triggered, this innate response mechanism is triggered, the archetype of the mother starts to emerge, but my mother is unstable, and right in the middle of nurturing me, she slaps me and throws me down and starts abusing me. This is a major frustration of archetypal intent. And this is an early stage, first stage individuation process, but that interferes with it. So I'm giving you a long answer to a short question, but the answer is yes. Things interfere with individuation all the time, and that's why we developed this what I'm calling artificial form of individuation. It's where we, and the whole, by the way, all of Jung 102 is pretty much dedicated to this so-called artificial process. But now another aspect of the question could be, when we're in that process, can we interfere? In other words, when we're consciously trying to nurture the individuation process, can we interfere? And the answer is yes. Now, if we can be, in other words, we can be like a hovering mother who doesn't allow a little boy to go out and play. We can do that to the individuation process. But if we're listening to the unconscious will send us messages saying, what the hell, leave me alone. I need to gestate. I need to, like a seed, I need a little bit of water, a little bit of moisture, a little bit of sunlight. Let me alone and let the process take place. And the dreams will tell us that. And that's part of the process that we want to be discussing in Jung 102 is how do we listen to the dreams? How do we know that the dream is saying this or that? So again, long answer to a short question, but is that satisfying?
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. So Jung points to the myth of the hero as a way to illustrate the tendency of the ego to descend into the unconscious during this second stage of individuation. We could call the hero's journey a myth of individuation. And there are many myths of individuation. Really, every religious form, every mythology in one way or another is, I won't say every one, but many, many of them are myths of individuation. Module, I want to say 5, I'm not sure, I think is the one on alchemy in this course. And alchemy is the, according to Jung, it's the myth of individuation par excellence. He loved alchemy and saw in it the myth for individuation of modern Western people. And so there's a lot really rich stuff there. But one of the ones, and of course many of us are familiar with Joseph Campbell and Jung's treatment of the hero in Symbols of Transformation, where this is a really important, especially in the Western world, myth of individuation. So as Eric Neumann puts it, in the process of realizing and assimilating an unconscious content, the ego makes a descent from the conscious standpoint into the depths in order to raise up the treasure. And that's represented very often. Here's one of the sort of Joseph Campbell models of the hero's journey. We're in the ordinary world, then all of a sudden there's a call to adventure. We may refuse the call, but then one way or another, we accept it, either consciously or unconsciously. We fall down the rabbit hole or whatever, and we cross the threshold. We are tested, we have allies, we encounter enemies, we approach the depths, the absolute depths. We go through an ordeal of rebirth, death and rebirth. We, just as we're on our way out, we grab the treasure and we bring it back to the ordinary world and we return with the elixir. This is one way of looking at this hero's journey. Now, the development of the ego-self axis could be compared to a continuous repetition of this cycle of the hero's myth. In other words, every time, again, this is just a metaphoric representation of, here we have the ego completely encased in the self, very little consciousness, just completely what Jung would call participation or participation mystique. And now as we go through one phase of the hero's journey, we've just rescued a little bit, separated a little bit of the ego from the self. We've got a little bit of the treasure. We go, some other crisis comes up, we go through another hero's journey and a little bit more. And as long as we maintain this connection, this dialogue between the ego and the self, we have what's called an ego-self axis. Now, when that ego-self axis breaks, we have alienation of the ego from the self. But when it kind of collapses onto itself, we have identification of the ego with the self, which is back over here. And our goal is to develop a stress. The first stage of the individuation process is to develop this strong ego that can regulate these energies that are radiating, these powerful life energies radiating off of the archetypal self. And the second half of life is reconnecting and maintaining, learning to maintain this ego-self axis. And we could say that the development of this axis could be compared to a continuous cyclical repetition, cycle of going through cycles of the hero myth. Now, this is Edward Edinger's sort of representation of this same process, but not in a mythological way, in a little bit more of a Jungian psychological way. So we start out in this one with original wholeness, ego self-identity. We get into a sense of active inflation where we tend to think we're something pretty great, and we do something heroic or inflated, which gets us in trouble. And we're so inflated that we're rejected. We become then alienated from the self. As I was talking about, there's either inflation, that is identification with the self, or alienation from the self. And it doesn't even necessarily be the self. It could be whatever archetype we're wrestling with at that time. Identification with the mother archetype, alienation from the mother archetype, that kind of thing. So the descent is an alienation from the self. We have to experience humility, repentance, a sacrificial attitude. Then when we accept our limitedness, we accept with humility, our sense of alienation, we begin to reconnect once again with the self. And these archetypal energies, again, we have a connection with, and we experience a passive inflation, or an inflation in which we're aware of some of the energies we have. And this is a sort of Jungian representation of that same hero myth that we were just showing.
Got a question for you here.
Yes.
Can you experience different stages of the hero's journey at the same time, but operating in different aspects of the psyche?
Yeah, well, that would be kind of like what I was saying before, when we are, for whatever reason, fragmented, and there's a complex, which the complex is still a wounded child, or is still undeveloped in the particular area. And I may be highly effective out in the world in some areas, but then if that trigger comes in and triggers my complex, that part of me could be in a completely different state. And part of the journey of working with these things is to be able to maintain one foot in that functional world, and that we keep paying the bills and taking care of the babies and doing the things that have to be done. And at the same time, we create a space, and this is the first module of Jung 102 includes the idea of creating I'm going to call it, for lack of a better term, a sacred space. We can call it anything we like. We can call it an analytical hour. We can call it an hour with our therapist. We can call it time with the 12-step group. But we create a space where we dedicate to that complex, to that wounded part, and we let the wounded part know that we have not abandoned it, and we start little by little developing the dialogue while maintaining the foothold in the world, so we don't allow everything to crumble while we're doing our inner work. We don't want to have this complete pendulum swing from functional to dysfunctional, functional to dysfunctional. We want to be able to be functional and yet address the parts of ourselves that need the work. Is that it?
Yes.
So, and this kind of addresses that in a different wording, but this whole cycle again is about identification and alienation from these powerful life energies that flow through us. The danger that we face when we do not learn how to manage our complexes and dialogue with the archetypes of the unconscious is twofold. We risk either falling prey to identification with archetypal energies, or alienation from archetypal energies. Identification is when we say, boy, I am the greatest thing ever. I am the king. Nobody knows how to do this better than me. And of course, we're out of touch with reality to the extent that we are not that. And we eventually walk into a wall or run our car into a tree or something. And we say, oh, I guess I wasn't that good at that. The alienated part is when we have no life energy. Everything is flat. We have no access to the energies that make us creative and make us feel like the world is wonderful, and make us feel like our friends are the greatest friends in the world. We're alienated from all that energy. We don't have our creative drive at all because we're alienated from the archetypal energies. Now, we don't want to be identified with them and get inflated, but we don't want to be alienated from them either. Dialoguing with and remaining in communication with the unconscious can help us to learn how to regulate and steward powerful archetypal energies. If we do not learn how to do so, we may become identified with the energies and think we are in control of them, when of course we're not, or we become alienated from our own life energies and fall into a deep depression. Again, this can be seen this way. It's just another way of understanding it. Active inflation, I think I'm the greatest. Alienated, oh, I think I'm the worst. And we cycle through that over and over again. Another way of looking at it is, here I am, I'm identified. The ego is completely identified with the self or the archetypal energies. And if you could erase this line here, that's we're calling the ego-self axis, and I'm completely alienated from the self, then I just feel like the world is flat and I have no energy whatsoever. Another way to look at it is there's the deep psychic energy that's just represented by geometrical figures, or animal figures, or God energies, or mother energies, or lover energies. But any of these archetypes could be the thing that we're wrestling with, either being identified with or alienated from. And the way to work on that is to develop a dialogue with these archetypes so that we do not experience identification, nor do we experience alienation from them. Again, just another way to look at the same diagram. So what I'm going to do now is run quickly through just the 8 modules and let you know what we're going to be covering in each one and how they apply to enacting this process. The idea is that each one of these techniques, all of these things we're going to be talking about over the next 8 weeks, are ways to work through this process, to keep ourselves from this trap of jostling between identification and alienation from these energies, so we can steward. Ultimately, the idea is to steward these energies for the benefit of our families and our communities and for the planet. Now, before I go through these 8 modules, are there any other questions about what I've been talking about so far?
We're clear in chat.
We're good. All right. So, module 1, sacred space, symbols, patterns, and amplification. This first module is going to be about looking at the main constituents of Jungian work. First, there must be a place reserved for the work to take place, not necessarily a physical location, but a time and a commitment to making sure that the work is going on a regular basis. Essential to the work that takes place in this space is an understanding of the nature of symbolic work and of the patterns that emerge from the study of the symbols produced by the unconscious. One of the main problems we get into, particularly if we're looking at dreams, or we're doing active imagination, or just in the way things play out in our lives, is that we don't understand how to look at things symbolically, and we take them literally, and we lose our connection. As soon as we take things literally, we've lost touch with the unconscious, because the unconscious only communicates, I won't say only, but most often, and the most powerful messages comes through patterns of symbols. And in order to understand the patterns of symbols and to use them for the work we're doing, we need to learn the technique of amplification. It's a key technique that Jung employed for understanding the symbols and patterns that emerge from the unconscious. Amplification means if I'm dreaming about, I don't know what, if I'm dreaming about flying and then crashing to the ground, I may want to look and study the myth of Icarus, who flew too high and his wings melted and he fell into the sea. So we find a way to sort of draw out the meaning of our dreams and our active imagination work by looking to these archetypal sources, where hopefully the meaning and the message of the symbols in the myths become meaningful. And it not only shows us some of the meaning in the work we're doing, but it also relativizes our discomfort, because we can see that experiencing this means that we're human. Human beings have had these same types of issues coming up for millennia, and that's why they've been immortalized and memorialized in myth and fairy tale and in various cultural artifacts, because they've always been human products, and it helps us to recognize that we're just a part of the human tribe. Amplification means to find similar symbols and patterns in cultural artifacts such as myths, fairy tales, alchemy, etc., that arise in dreams and active imagination. Another important idea that we'll touch on in this first module is the idea of compensation. Essential to Jung's method is the understanding that the unconscious will compensate the conscious attitude in an attempt to bring the psychic system into balance. So when we see one of these symbols, and even when we understand the message of the symbol, we want to understand that the unconscious is saying something about my conscious attitude needs to be balanced out in a way that this symbol is trying to help me to understand. So obviously, anyone who's done any kind of work in depth psychology is aware of the importance of the dream. And in Module 2, we'll start right out with a look at Jung's approach to dream work. As is common in most approaches to depth psychology, Jung felt that dreams were a direct expression of unconscious psychic activity, and as such could provide important clues as to what unconscious factors may be seeking expression. In this module, we'll look at specifics of Jung's techniques of dream analysis, as well as techniques and approaches used by later Jungians. Now, there's a whole lot more to say about that, but there's so much more, I don't want to get too caught up in that, so I'm just going to keep moving on. There's lots and lots of things. As I said, we could do an 8-module class on dream work alone. Same thing with active imagination. Along with dream work, active imagination is Jung's second most important approach to working with the unconscious. Whereas in dream work, we more or less passively allow the unconscious to communicate with us through dreams. In active imagination, we actively, consciously enter into a dialogue with the images and symbols that have arisen from the unconscious. In this module, we'll look at how Jung developed active imagination and how he applied the technique in his own work. Now, although active imagination is a specific technique used by Jung as a way of dialoguing with images and symbols that emerge from the unconscious, Jung and his followers have developed many additional techniques that spring from the basics of active imagination. The key premises of active imagination have been expanded and applied to a number of expressive techniques, including but not limited to dance, art, music, sand play, and many of you probably know many other things. When Jung started, he was really, I said this before in Jung 101, he was a 19th century man. It's extraordinary that someone from that era could come up with some of the things she came up with. For us, it's some of these things, it's commonplace now to see people doing this kind of work, but it all springs from Jung's amazing discoveries and the work that he did in the teens and 20s of the last centuries. And in this module, we'll look at a number of these techniques and discuss how and why they can be helpful in working through the individuation process. Now, those are the two main techniques. Everything else is going to be about different ways to amplify and different ways to understand the symbols and the content that emerge from the dreams and the active imagination work, whatever method we may choose to use. So obviously there's much to say about Jung and myth, and we'll only get to some of it in Module 4. The aspect of myth that is essential for applied Jungian psychology is the use of mythology for the amplification of dream images and the figures encountered in active imagination. Again, amplification is key to a lot of the work with myth. In this context, we look for parallel images and symbols that seem to correspond to the images and symbols that arise in the psyche while doing inner work. Additionally, however, one must still have some understanding of the meaning of the myth if we're to extrapolate from the myth the meaning of the dream image. For Jung, myths are original revelations of the preconscious psyche, involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings. But these happenings happened at a particular time and place, and so as such, the meaning of a myth must be understood within the context of the group within which it first appeared. In this module, we'll look at many of these different considerations that arise when working with myths. Another great resource for amplification and just understanding the psyche is fairy tales. Module 5, we'll be looking at fairy tales, and like myths, fairy tales provide an enormous amount of material for amplification. There's a difference, though, between cultural mythologies and fairy tales, which tend to be regional. According to Marie-Louise von Franz, Dr. Jung once said that it is in fairy tales that one can best study the comparative anatomy of the psyche. In myths or legends or any other more elaborate mythological material, we get at the basic patterns of the human psyche through a lot of cultural material. But in fairy tales, there is much less specific cultural conscious material. and therefore they mirror the basic patterns of the psyche more clearly. In other words, for example, let me see. Yeah. I'm primarily of Scots-Irish heritage, and Scottish and Irish mythologies are very helpful to me in understanding my own family dynamics and patterns and my ancestry. The same mythologies might not have the same resonance for someone of Jewish or Nordic or Germanic background. Fairy tales, on the other hand, have usually not been passed through a cultural filter in the same way and modified over time to fit the broad public of a given culture in the same way that cultural myths have. So fairy tales are particularly useful in getting to the real nuts and bolts of how the psyche works and how it responds to certain stimuli. And I'm sure many of you are aware the work of Marie-Louise von Franz is just unsurpassed in this area. So fairy tales can often tell us more about the basic human structures of the psyche that transcend cultural differences than myths can. And in this module, we'll discuss a number of different ways that fairy tales can be applied to Jungian work, and we'll particularly look at the way that Marie-Louise von Franz looks at and interprets fairy tales. Now, favorite area of mine, I'd said before, module 5, it's module 6, alchemical processes and individuation. Alchemy is, as I said, a wonderful myth of individuation. It was a favorite of Jung's, and it is really, really different from a lot of myths and it's almost like a hybrid of myth and fairy tale because of the specificity of how it developed and where it developed and what's integrated in it. So in this module 6, we'll enter into one of Jung's most important discoveries, that the fantasies of the early alchemists were actually a myth of individuation. Not only that, the myths and symbols of alchemy incorporate and integrate all of the major mythologies of the Western world: astrology, fairy tales, the Holy Grail, biblical imagery, metallurgy, the myths of the earth and of the chemical elements from which all matter is constructed, and more. All of these are brought together in an extraordinary way in alchemy. And this is one of the things that fascinated Jung so much in his work with alchemy. Furthermore, alchemy is not simply a system of static images and symbols. The myths of alchemy describe a process, a dynamic movement of energy that mirrors the activity of the psyche in the individuation process. Remember how I said earlier, psychic energy is key to this whole thing, and how the psychic energy moves, whether we're alienated from the psychic energy or identified with it. And the way the alchemists work with this, they fire up the, we were talking about the sacred space earlier, because I didn't want to bring in alchemy, but another way to describe the sacred space, the place where the work takes place, is the container. For the alchemists, it was this very tightly sealed, hermetically sealed container where that heat would be applied, and this transformation would happen inside. Well, that, for Jung, he's got a whole number of essays and writings about how that is the analytical container. This is the consultation room in which the two people come together, and it's sealed. And that's when we talk about having a tightly sealed container where the work can take place, and we don't talk too much about the work outside of it. We do it all in this one place. Well, that's a part of the metaphor of the container in alchemy, where the transformation of physical matter is transformed either into the elixir of life, or the philosopher's stone, or the actual metal gold.
I got a question for you here.
Yeah.
That's a good question. It's actually one I had when I started out. How did Jung reconcile science with mythology, fairy tales, and alchemy?
Well, when I, I'll just take 2 seconds and answer that question. Yeah, that's a big question, but it's well, I need to know more about from the questioner. What do you mean by that?
Catherine, you want to hop on and ask, or you can just type it. Oh, she's a scientist and has had a hard time with those.
Sure. Well, here's one way to think of it. And both Freud and Jung address this in different ways in their work, that there are two kinds of thinking. There's directed thinking and there's undirected thinking. And scientists privilege directed thinking. We can think of this also as right brain and left brain thinking. But directed thinking is engagement with the reality principle of the world, but it often shuts off the fountain of life energy, which flows through undirected thinking. So the reconciliation is that it's actually as you know, I'm sure, Jung considered his project very, very much a scientific project. And it is very scientific if you know how to follow his way of thinking and his way of understanding science. And his privileging, see, his main argument was that whether you're a scientist or not, he used the expression a priori, which means the first encounter with anything is through the psyche. So you can't claim to be a scientist observing something else if the instrument by which you're observing it is not understood. And by instrument here, he means the psyche. The psyche needs to be understood. The psyche is the first thing to observe anything, whether it's scientifically or not. So the first thing has to be to understand the instrument. So all of this business of fantasy and myth is the product of the psyche, and he studies them in order to scientifically understand the instrument by which he's studying things. How does that help you? Does that do anything?
I think that's good. That is actually out of Symbols of Transformation, right? The two types of thinking.
It may be. I was reading it recently in something else, but
yeah.
Catherine, how's that for Catherine? Does that help?
A little bit, but I will need more later.
Sure. Well, I think didn't I see that you're signed up for the course? I'll be happy to. I'll think about that some more. But it's a main question that everybody has. But you have to first of all reconcile yourself to Jung's assumptions, which are that the psyche is the first instrument, the instrument through which everyone, including scientists, observes the world.
I battled with this myself. I just want to put that out there, because just the rational mindset.
Yeah, well, and a lot of how I would answer that will also depend on how precise you can be in your question, because there are different things about Jung's work that can seem challenging to us, and exactly what that is. I need to know what that is before I can think of a way to respond. But clearly, Catherine, you're sympathetic, or you would not be so enthusiastic about encountering Jung more and more. But yeah, I will do my best to respond to that as time goes on, and I hope that was helpful at least.
Yep, good to
go. Okay, so understanding the imagery of alchemy can be enormously useful in understanding the imagery generated by the unconscious, particularly for Western people, or people who have emerged out of this sort of Indo-European, and also there's the Grail, and there's a really interesting dance that goes on between the Middle Eastern imagery of the Hebrew Bible and Christianity, and this whole Western so-called pagan tradition that was kind of buried by the influx of the Christian faith. And all of that gets acted out. And according to Jung, it gets things that Christianity kind of threw its hands up and gave up on, continue to be worked on in alchemy, according to Jung. So anyways, there's lots and lots going on in alchemy that I love, and I think everyone will find at very least fascinating and useful. So in this module, we will touch on many of the exciting aspects of alchemy and how they can be applied to Jungian work. And now with module 7 and 8, we kind of hopefully turn the lens towards bigger fish, rather than just thinking about ourselves. And people always say that, well, Jungians and these psychological people are just navel gazers. And so how is this going to affect culture? How is this going to affect society in the world? And how does one man working on himself, Jung was famous for saying, someone asked him, well, are we doomed? Is mankind just going to destroy themselves? And he said, not if enough people do inner work. In other words, and Jung said also many times, I'm not afraid of bombs or guns or any of that stuff. I'm afraid of ideas. It's human beings who get obsessive ideas that are more dangerous than any instrument of destruction. It's how those things are used and how the ideas activate the person. So all of that is to say that with this module, we'll begin to look at some of the ways that we can use Jungian theory to understand culture. Jung was intensely interested in applying his theory to understanding culture, especially for understanding the institutions of Christianity. We'll also look at some of the recent work of Thomas Singer and Samuel Kimball's and others on the idea of the cultural complex. My own interest in this area is in understanding how the lack of masculine initiation process in our culture has led to a world of uninitiated boys running the world. And we'll discuss all of these and more in this module, just ways in which the kind of work we do here can, as I've been saying since the beginning, can move us towards generativity and creating positive culture rather than simply, as some people accuse Jungians, simply navel gazing. So finally, in Module 8, we want to look at ancestry, spiritual practice, and ritual eldership. And this is about not simply understanding culture, but stewarding the archetypal energies that we've been learning to process, regulate, and work with. How can we as individuals move towards this process of becoming stewards of archetypal energies? In the end, the task of the hero or heroine is to bring back to the community the treasure that we have retrieved from the underworld. This treasure is the archetypal life force that we carry with us and share with others. In this module, we'll look at the role of ancestry, spiritual practice, and ritual eldership in this process of stewarding archetypal energies for, as I said, family, community, culture, and for the world. Now, that's pretty much what we hope to do in Jung 102. I also want to say a few words about the online learning platform. I've said that a little bit already, but anyone who wants to take the course is welcome to simply audit the course, enjoy the weekly lectures, and leave it at that, and that can be fun, and you'll still have access to all these other things if you want to, but you can just leave them alone if you don't. And many people, and I know people who have already signed up again for this course, did that with the last course. We're just perfectly happy with that. However, if you would like to receive credit towards certification for taking this course, you will be required to purchase, or at least to read and be familiar with, the book Inner Work by Robert Johnson. As I've said, this is not, I don't see this as the perfect book, but I think it's a good way. He's certainly very, very Jungian, and his techniques are very much related to and grounded in Jung, and it gives us one way to look at how how Jung's theory can be applied in a practical way. And I hope we'll see many, many other ways. As I've said, in Haiku, we'll be able to access many, many other articles and book chapters and videos and things like that. So there's not going to be just that, but the main core, and again, as much or as little as you want of these, but Inner Work will be an essential element of the quizzes and some of the basic work that we do. So you will also need to successfully complete the assignments, which are not, and you can ask people, there are people here I know on the call who took the last course and successfully went through it, and they're not onerous assignments, and they can be a lot of fun. And as long as you read and understand and listen to the lectures, you really won't have trouble with the assignments. But we need to make sure that people are really engaging. So these are not terribly difficult assignments, but it will be, and it will not be difficult to, it will be difficult to complete them successfully if you've not followed along and read the book and the supplementary readings provided in the modules. But again, I think you'll find it more fun than difficult. As I've said, you may follow along in the course without participating in the online platform experience and without engaging in the readings or other assignments. However, if you do choose to participate in the learning platform experience, you'll be given access to a host of additional resources, including embedded videos, discussion forums, short quizzes to test your knowledge, and a final paper assignment, again, which is only a couple pages. So please feel free to ask me any questions you may have about the learning platform. If you're unsure about the learning platform or find it difficult to navigate once you've begun to use it, I will schedule a special group meeting to walk people through the process. And last time I did that, the first module, I had about a half hour or an hour before the class on Saturday. I was available and we covered pretty much everything. And if that's not enough, I can do it subsequently week, or I can meet with people privately. As I say, it's not that hard, but I want to make sure, I want to kind of put people's fears at rest about that. And of course, as I say, I'll be available through the week via email and via the Haiku discussion board. And that's all I have to say about that. But I do want to spend the rest of the time, just as long as anybody wants, just chatting about what you would like to chat about. Any questions at all?
Got anything? I'll be watching chat. Sarah says here, I am very interested to sign up for this course. However, as I personally experienced the work as something that was naturally timed, I doubt whether anyone is likely to do that work without feeling that inner necessity. Have you had an experience with people going through an artificial individuation process without being guided there? And if so, does it have similar effects?
If so, what?
Does it have similar effects?
So have I seen people go through the natural process without going through the artificial process? Is that the question?
I'm trying to follow it. Have you had experience with people going through an artificial individuation process without being guided there?
Well, without going through it, anyone who's aware of Jung, I don't think it's possible to do a natural, completely natural individuation process once you are kind of aware of Jung and of this idea of doing inner work, because already your conscious mind is engaged in that. The typical way for people to do that without, I assume you're saying without going through, without having a therapist or just doing the work on your own. That's addressed specifically in the book Inner Work by Robert Johnson. And I'll just say here, yeah, it certainly can be done. A typical way to do it, something that I've done is, periodically for various times, from the time I was a teenager on, I would work intensely with a therapist or later with group therapy and things like that, and then do the work on my own and bring the work that I'm doing, the homework I'm doing, bring that to the group or bring it to the therapist and work with it. And then when, for whatever reason, it was time to move on, I would just keep doing, as I do even today, keep doing the best I can with inner work. Another way that people regulate energy while doing inner work is by having some sort of a spiritual practice that helps to make the psyche aware that that the ego knows that it is not that energy. It is not that. It is. It may be that sort of on the absolute level, but not on the level of being able to regulate all that energy on its own and say that it's the be all and end all of that energy. So yeah, that's the usual process that I've seen of people that kind of go back and forth. Otherwise, for example, there'd be, and Jung commented on this a lot, if someone is absolutely invested in a spiritual path, say they're Catholic, he would encourage them to just go to the priest and stay in that, called an Umwelt, that's the German word, but stay in that world. And that helps you to regulate the energies, and you don't need to engage in these kind of processes that we're talking about. However, if that's not working for you, if you're not able to accept the dogmas of the church and you're not able to sit in the math without snickering or thinking that it's not really, you're not really in the myth, you're outside of the myth, then you really need to engage in some sort of ongoing work to regulate the energies. Because if you If you continue to snicker, then you tend to think that you're somehow bigger than the deity. And if you don't, if you just feel depressed about it, then you're alienated from the energy. So one is identified and the other is alienated. So understanding some way, working out some way to dialogue with these energies is essential to avoiding those two traps of identification or alienation. I hope that helps. I see the question, how does one know if one is individuated? Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, if you think you're individuated, then you definitely know you're not, because that's a state of inflation. The point is, individuation isn't, it's kind of, people always say it's not a destination, it's a journey. Well, that's what individuation is. It's a journey. It's not you get to the place and, oh, I'm individuated and now I can stop doing this. We're always, as long as we are alive, we are radiating, we are a vessel for this flow of life energy. And this life energy it doesn't stop. It keeps going and going and going. And we need to be able to regulate that energy somehow. We need to be able to steward it in a way that benefits us and our families and our community, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're so busy working that our complexes are not overwhelming us, then we know we're working our individuation. And that's the best I think we can hope for, is that we're working on the individuation process. It's a process, not a destination. It's an ongoing thing that we keep doing. Does that help?
See the one above there, it said, interested to understand your notion of generativity and the purpose of the work. I suppose my question is, the purpose for the world, is this the purpose for the world or the soul, or maybe both?
Well, the first purpose, again, there are two stages. The first stage of individuation is developing a strong ego where we are able to maintain ourselves in an effective way in the world. We are human beings in modern times, and we need to be able to pay our bills and maintain ourselves so we don't get caught up in an addiction of some kind, and we don't grab a rifle and go shooting people, or all those different things. So we need to do, we need that much individuation on the first level. And on the second level, we reach a point where we need to be able to, as I say you hear a lot of this, people who are 40, 50 years old, they made a lot of money, they retired, and then they kind of go nuts. Why? Well, because they're not regulating that energy. The work that they were doing that helped them to get to that place was what regulated the energy. And now they need some other way to regulate the energy. So whether it's through a spiritual practice, or whether it's through work for the community, or work for, someone like Bill Gates starts a foundation and he's kind of funneling money out through that. Well, that's at least from the outside, that sounds like a very healthy thing, because he's got enormous, imagine the grandiosity that could overwhelm a person when you got that much material wealth. You have to sort of keep that energy moving just to avoid being overwhelmed by the grandiosity of this life energy that flows through us. So those are two methods. It's not even, see, then we get into these, very often you'll find when you're doing Jungian work, you end up coming against metaphysical or spiritual questions, because then you want to ask the question, well, am I doing this just to regulate the energies, or is it healthier, or am I doing this for spiritual reasons? Is there, there's these ethical questions of, in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, it will say that you need to do the right thing because it's right, and then you'll get a good result. But if you do it for the good result, you are not doing it for the right reason. So you get these kind of ethical catch-22s. Yeah, we could go on and on about that, but I hope that addresses the question somehow.
Yep. are there concrete examples of exercises given that translate to a personal practice or a practice with clients in the course?
Yeah, well, I like the word practice because, first of all, it's related to, it usually is, we talk about spiritual practice and having a ritual that you do every day or something like that. But the reason I like it is because it implies that it's something that you do on a regular basis. And again, as long as we're alive, then this fountain of life energy is flowing through us always. So it doesn't stop just because we stop doing our practice, whatever that is. So one kind of practice is just to write down your dreams. And if you didn't have a dream, you write down, I didn't have a dream today. Or another practice is to do some active imagination, or to have a 12-step group, or to have a CODA group, or to have a therapy group, or something that you go to, something that you do, some regular way that you remind the psyche that you know, and you remind your ego that you know that you are not in charge of everything, that the ego is not running everything, that no matter what the ego says, this life energy is going to keep flowing. And if you try to stop it, you're going to either become, as I say, alienated from it or identified with it on one level or another. And it's important to have some kind of a practice that will help you to regulate that energy. And it could be, now, again, it becomes a tricky question, because if you strictly are doing a spiritual practice, then you're not necessarily doing depth psychology, but it's still going to regulate the energies. And that's the thing that you want to do, is to regulate the energy and keep the energy from overwhelming you and driving you into one of these two poles of alienation or identification. But it's not necessarily depth psychology, and that's fine, because regardless of whether you're a scientist or whether you're a religious person, you must, in order to avoid grandiosity and to avoid alienation, these two poles, you must have the humility to recognize that you do not know everything. Even a scientist has to recognize that they don't know everything, or they're just not in touch with reality. And likewise, a religious person may think he knows everything because the scripture tells him it, but he has to know that on some level he's taking it on faith. He doesn't know everything. So something to remind us to be humble and to let the energies flow through us, rather than trying to grab hold of the energies or stop the energies, is required.
Leanne has another one here. So another metaphysical question. You use the term epiphenomenon in relation to consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as Jung's view? I would tend to the primacy of spirit over matter rather than consciousness arising out of matter, i.e. epiphenomenon.
Yeah, well, this is a metaphysical question. Is consciousness an epiphenomenon of matter, or is matter an epiphenomenon of consciousness? That's what religious people will tend to say, that there's this energy which is divine energy, which, as a result of that, the world was created. And a religious person will say that, a scientist will tend to say, there was a big bang and there's this matter and all these biochemical things happened, and an epiphenomenon of that is consciousness. What I was saying when I used epiphenomena, I was talking about the ego as being an epiphenomena of consciousness, and I think even a scientist would agree with that. And I might be wrong in the sense that it depends on how you define ego. In some ways, ego is without ego you don't have consciousness, because you have to be able to reflect back, but then you get into all these different abstract questions about consciousness, which I don't want to get into. But when we talk about these things, it shows you how when we talk about these things, you got to have some foothold somewhere. That's why knowing where the theory is and where one thing starts and another begins can be helpful, because as soon as we start talking about consciousness, we have very few footholds. But then when you start talking about the unconscious, you have virtually no footholds. So having some theory to work with is helpful. And I don't claim to know the answer to all those things. My bias is to say that matter is an epiphenomenon of spirit, but that's my personal bias. what Jung's view is, Jung was very invested in being a scientist. He was very much wanted his work accepted as scientific work. He wanted it understood as scientific work. He presented it in a way that he felt was profoundly scientific. But that's different from what he believed as a man outside of, when he took off his hat of the scientist, and he went home, what did he believe? I think you tend to, if you want to find out what he believed about that, if you read his interviews, watch some of his interviews where he's interviewed on film, and read his memories, dreams, and reflections, you get a much better idea of what he believed, which is why he didn't want memory, dreams, and reflections included in the collected works, because he wanted the collected works to be pure science. So what he believed, I think he was definitely a very spiritual person, and he believed that there was something more than just biochemical reaction going on with human beings, but and I think there's plenty of evidence for that. But I'll leave it to other people to decide exactly what he believed. So I'm interested in, Richard Rooney says, it's a vastly important work considering the collective stunting that has happened in the individuation process. Look to the current political environment. I'm not going to talk too much about politics. I want to avoid that as much as possible, but look to I really appreciate your attempting to make these approaches more accessible. Curious of your thoughts on how one convinces others of the necessity of doing shadow work. How does one help others overcome that natural resistance to embarking on the hero's journey? Well, I personally don't try to convince people. I try to be available to people who want to know about what I think and about those kind of things. But there's an old saying: a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, or a woman convinced against her will. I don't think it pays to try to convince people of anything. The bet, and this again, we're getting over, I get over into the spiritual realm, but I think it's also very true. First of all, the only real scientific theory, truly scientific theory we have in psychology is called attachment theory. John Bowlby, I highly recommend him. His work very much supports Jung's work. And Anthony Stevens, who's a wonderful Jungian, one of my favorites, his dissertation chair was John Bowlby, and he taught Bowlby a lot about Jung, and Bowlby ended up liking Jung quite a lot. But attachment theory pretty much has proven that there's an instinctual need to love. There's an instinctual need to be attached to others. We're social beings, but particularly for infants and coming up through the developmental process, attachment is a vital aspect of the human condition. And again, proven indisputably by attachment theorists. And the reason I say that is, rather than try to convince people about the shadow and all that, you be as loving and as kind and as good a person as you can be. And when the shadow kicks that person in the butt, which it will do, you be there for them. And maybe you say, gee, I wonder if that was the shadow, or that kind of thing. People will not respond to, for my experience has been, they will not respond to me shoving it down their throat. But if I lovingly am there for them, and in the midst of that I point out some things that, ask them questions, I truly believe that people have the answers to these questions within themselves. And if I ask the right question in a gentle and truly and genuinely concerned way, they will respond in ways that will move them in that direction. I believe this stuff is absolutely true. And so the logic of experience will lead people to the right answers, but they have to be sometimes kept warm in the nest. They have to be kind of coddled a little bit. And then, if they're behaving badly, then I know how to have boundaries as well. But anyways, that's my answer to that.
Another one here.
Yes.
What volumes do you think one should read at the beginning of this exploration in regards to the collected works?
In regards to this course, you mean?
I think she meant just collected works in general.
Collected works in general. Jeepers. Well, I wouldn't really start. I wouldn't start with the collected works because it's a. I mean, if I was going to start, actually, I did start with the collected works, and I read two things first, and that was two essays on analytical psychology, which is excellent. I mean, it's very, very dense and very kind of intense reading. And I read it when I was 18 years old, and I had the dictionary by my side at all times. That one, and then I got the Portable Jung, which was edited by this guy I'd never heard of named Joseph Campbell. This was, again, I was like 18 when I found this book. But yeah, so Joseph Campbell writes the introduction to Portable Jung, got a great selection of essays, including actually the two essays on analytical psychology, but I got them separately first. But yeah, so those are good places to start. His writings on alchemy, actually, particularly the book Psychology and Alchemy, are actually I find them quite easy to read. They're not as, I mean, his later works on alchemy, like Mysterium Conjunctionis, is one of the most difficult things you'll ever pick up. But Psychology and Alchemy is made up of, I believe, mostly essays that he delivered first at the Eranos conferences, and they're meant for a general, intelligent reader and not a specialist. And I think they're easy to read, but they don't tell you a whole lot about theory. The two essays on analytical psychology tell you more about theory. But if you really want to understand Jung and kind of get a foothold into different places, if you read something like Jung's Map of the Soul, that is all grounded in Jung's writings, and it's got beaucoup footnotes, and you can go from there to the collected works and read specific things. There are other books like, there's a whole series called Encountering Jung on different topics, which is an excellent way to start reading Jung. Jung on mythology, Encountering Jung on alchemy, Encountering Jung on death and immortality. There's a lot of those. There's also one, Meredith, I want to say Sabini, is that, I'm probably getting the last name wrong, did a collection, not in that series, but it's a similar type collection on Jung and nature, Jung and the natural world, which is just fabulous reading. There's also a book called Jung Speaking, C.G. Jung Speaking, which is a collection of really nice, just random artifacts of Jung, articles here and there, talks that he gave, collected into a volume, which is a nice way to read Jung without being kind of overwhelmed. The problem with Jung is that he has a lot of digressions in his work. You'll be reading and you'll be, oh yeah, I get it. And then all of a sudden he'll start amplifying something. He was very much a cluster thinker. He would get into amplification of images, and he'll be talking, and he does this in Symbols of Transformation. He'll be talking about a hero, and then the next thing you know, he's off in the Mideast, and then he's off in China, and he's pulling together all these different things. Why? Because he's amplifying the image. He takes one image and he sees how that image played out in all these different cultural contexts. And that's very good for understanding the image and again, amplifying it, expanding it, kind of blowing it up. But it makes for some tough going for just, an afternoon's reading.
Got one more here from Rob. So he doesn't know how to ask this or word it, but is there any study of, has the role life energy been in some ways, has it been hijacked by financial energy? Golden rule rewritten as who owns the gold rules?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's sort of I don't know, I see it as like a trinity, a holy trinity of science, money, and celebrity are like where the God energy is in our culture. Science seems to be rapidly falling to the dust these days, but yeah, there's plenty of different places, but definitely money is got to be at the top right now of the God. If someone came from another planet and was going to ask, what do they worship down there? What's their God? I think they would say money. Material wealth and material things seem to trump any ethical considerations. But yeah, definitely. And that's, again, if we look at that literally, it's cause for despair. But when we look at it, when we see it symbolically, we can see that there's room to work there. There's ways to be healthy, because again, it may take a long time, but the people who worship those things, eventually the shadow gets them one way or another. And there may have to be a huge international catastrophe before it gets them, and I hope it doesn't come to that. But that is what happens. So the more we can be aware of the symbolic value of these things, and kind of on our own, and certainly with the help of like-minded others, withdraw projections from these kind of things, withdraw projections from celebrity and from money and from it used to be in the Middle Ages that the people who had the last word, the king would want to do something, but he couldn't quite do it until he went to the theologians and talked to the theologians. And, the Pope or somebody had to give him the go-ahead that he could do something, because the theologians were the ones who had all the power. But now it's the people with the money. And, when you're in certain areas of life, the people with the money will go to like the medical doctors or the scientists and make sure they get the go-ahead. So science and money and celebrity seem to be the place where numinosity is placed. So we are way past our time. As I said, I'm happy to go forever. I see we still got 37 people. I'm delighted that you all stuck around. Things are not going well when people start dropping off. So I'm happy to go on. If you got more questions, just let me know. Do you see any more questions, Jeremy?
Well, I think we're all caught up.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank everybody very, very much. I hope you all immediately sign up for the course. But if not, I hope I see you again on another webinar or some function at the Depth Psychology Alliance. I know if you're not a member of the Depth Psychology Alliance, I hope you will become one. We're very, very fortunate to have the wonderful Bonnie Bright constantly working hard to push out great programs that are coming out all the time. Her symposium, it's not too late to get on board the Earth Symposium. Can't tell you the whole long name, but there's a wonderful Earth Symposium with some great Jungians and great people giving great talks and great information, and you can take part also in discussions online, live discussions with them after you've watched their videos and their talks. So I hope you'll do that, and I hope you'll all be active in the Depth Psychology Alliance, and I hope to see you all again real soon.
Thank you, James.